So I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are privileged to be able to live, work, and play on this land as Nova Scotians. So thank you all for sharing your time with me yet again, and welcome to the third installment of the ILNS Employer Engagement Series, Accessible Hiring and Recruiting. So ILNS is a registered charity supporting persons with disabilities to make informed choices about how they want to live their lives. And I am Michelle Sayers. This is the third session. So today we're going to be talking about writing an inclusive ad, accessible interviewing, best hiring practices for inclusivity and diversity, and accommodating employees. And next week, our final topic will be creating an inclusive environment. So again, the goal of these sessions is for me to advocate for people with disabilities and to support them to find lasting and meaningful employment, but also to educate and support employers in adapting to changing workplace cultures and accommodating diversity. The world is changing really quickly, and the employers who are going to make those changes and stay current are the ones who are going to get the best, especially the next generation coming up. Inclusivity and diversity is really important. So you want to make sure we're adapting. So let's jump right in and start with how to write an inclusive job ad. So inclusive job descriptions help to select the right person for each job and can also increase your recruitment reach. There's a lot of folks with disabilities out there who would be a really good fit for your organization, but sometimes the ads are not accessible to them, or they don't feel like your workplace is accessible or inclusive, and that may deter them from applying to your job. So there are some responsibilities which the employer has. Legally, you have to define all essential job functions. So making sure that there's a really clear list about what the job actually entails. Prepare job descriptions before advertising any vacancies or interviewing any applicants. So being really clear about what the job description is and what you're looking for. And employment should be defined by a person's ability to perform the essential and critical job functions. So as an employer, you can't disqualify a person from employment if they are unable to perform any non-essential job functions. So it's really important to be really clear about what the essential function of the job is and outline that clearly, because there may be some things that require accommodation for non-essential job functions, and those folks should still be included in your job search and hiring. So writing an inclusive job posting. So this has become a trend, which is really great for most industries, that they have an equal opportunity policy and that they have links to that in their ads. So if you go on Indeed or the Job Bank or whatever, you'll see links to the website for the organization, which should be an accessible website, and we are going to talk about how to make websites more accessible as well, and links to equal opportunity policy. Let the person see that you have a policy in place, you're following that policy, and that it's important to you to be an equal opportunity employer. Clearly state that you are an equal opportunity employer. This really signals to job seekers that you are aiming for an inclusive workforce. And include contact info if the applicant does require an accommodation or if they have any more information and want to reach out to someone directly. It just shows that you're really approachable. So some examples I have here of actual equal opportunity employer disclosures that I found in job ads recently. So I'll just use ILNS for an example. So saying something like ILNS offers equal opportunity and equal employment opportunities to all applicants and employees, and does not discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, country of origin, age, or disability. So that's a really simple one. They can get a little bit more involved, like the one on the right here. ILNS is committed to creating a diverse environment and is proud to be an equal opportunity employer. Upon request, ILNS will provide reasonable accommodation for disabilities to support participation of candidates in all aspects of the recruitment process. So that one's a little bit longer and more involved, but you can see that it really speaks to the goal of the employer here to make it as accessible as possible for the job seeker, which is a really appealing option to job seekers who have disabilities. So consider what you can say when you're hiring. What does the company value about itself and its employees? What can your company show to prove that it reflects those values? Like, do you have an equal opportunity policy? How do you want potential employees to feel when they read a recruitment post? And can you include a unique statement to attract a more diverse workforce? This is really an opportunity to showcase how inclusive you are and that you're looking for those kinds of folks to join your organization. So in a basic formula, the structure might look like company and brand plus values plus evidence of past practice. So let's look at an example of a really creative one. This is a real one that I actually found through some digging on Indeed. It's a tech company, and tech companies are really well known for their inclusive policies. And I really like this one. So it's blank is proud to be an equal opportunity employer. Blank embraces and is committed to building a diverse and inclusive workforce that respects and empowers the cultures and perspectives within our global teams. We strive to reflect the communities we serve and make it a point to make sure all employees feel valued and comfortable being their authentic selves at work. We know diversity is our strength. It enables us to view projects and ideas from different vantage points and allows every individual to bring value to the table in their own unique way. But don't take our word for it. Check out some of our Women in Leadership and Diversity Awards. And then they have a link to their webpage, which is full of all these awesome articles written about how inclusive they are. So, this might be a really specific example, but I like a lot of the aspects that they put in. And think about how, if you were a person with a disability, how you might feel reading something like this, right? You might feel like that would be a really good fit for you and that you feel really valued there and that they are aiming for that inclusivity. So things like that to think about when we're making an ad. So after we have our ad out, we want to make sure that the application process is inclusive. So we want to think about what it means to be an equal opportunity employer, and do we have those policies in place? And how accessible is the application process? So for example, is it accessible to persons who are blind or visually impaired? Are you flexible to accept applications via other methods other than electronically? So, in this day and age, everything is digital, but for some folks that can be really challenging. So we just want to make sure that we are including those folks so that we have a way that they can reach out and ask some questions. Some places will offer alternatives to a resume, such as a video. You can make a short video and talk about your skills or abilities, or an online portfolio, or like a link to your website, or in LinkedIn or something like that. And this flexibility could be helpful for someone who can't write a resume, or who is better with oral testing as opposed to written. So there are a lot of service providers out there that can help folks with resume writing, but for some people, it is really hard to access those. So we just want to make sure that we're offering other solutions for folks. You want to think about your website and how accessible it is. What impression will a potential employee have about your policies from your website? If inclusivity and diversity are important to you, put that on your website. Make it really clear for folks. Employer websites, including career pages, portals, and applications, must be accessible to people with disabilities. We want to be thinking about people who are using screen readers, so people who are visually impaired. They'll have an application which will read the screen out to them. And sometimes if you have a picture and it doesn't have a caption, they might miss that vital information. So we want to be thinking about things like that. The ILNS website is a good example. If you want an example, like we have an application on our website built in that will read the website for you. So that's really helpful. Employers must ensure that disabled applicants and employees can apply for jobs, access payroll and benefit information, and obtain other information through the website in an accessible way. So we want to be thinking about those kinds of policies as well for our existing employees and anyone who want to join our team. So some of that inclusive technology, there are a few key areas that are particularly difficult for job seekers with disabilities. So complex navigation and timeout restrictions. So if your website has any of those kinds of restrictions in place, for folks who read a little bit slower, they might need more time, and so those timeout restrictions can be really limiting. Poor screen contrast for folks who are visually impaired, and also folks who are colorblind. So applications that rely on color, graphics, or text embedded with graphics to convey directions or important information. So for example, if you have a map showing where your building is located, underneath that picture, you'll just want to write the instructions out as well. So making sure that things are written in a couple of different ways. Images that convey information but don't have alternative text for individuals using screen readers. So same thing, just making sure that we're putting a caption at the bottom of any images so that any screen readers will catch that. Applications that can't be navigated with keystrokes and require a mouse. For some folks with mobility issues, it's much easier just to, click yes or no, Y or N instead of have to move the mouse. Things like that are really easy to implement, and folks without disabilities don't think twice about it, but it can be really helpful for folks who need that assistance. Videos or audio instructions need to be closed captioned for hearing impaired folks. And those CAPTCHA tests, those need to have an audio option as well. And most of them do, but just making sure that that audio option is included. And just making sure that there's information on how they can request an accommodation if they need it, or if someone they can contact if they have any additional information that they couldn't access on the website. So keeping those kinds of things in mind. I also want to touch briefly on service providers are really helpful and a really untapped resource for employers. So some of the things that we offer is we help to ensure a full understanding of job duties and roles. So if you've hired an employee with a disability and you're doing a group training and there's a bunch of different people training at once, it might be hard to always accommodate that person. And while you do have to make sure their accommodations are in place, having a service provider accompany that person can really help, because they can kind of break things down and they can explain things differently for you. They're also really great at matching opportunities to job seekers. So for example, here at ILNS, our program is 6 months long. So at the end of the program, when I'm matching folks with jobs, I know them really well. I know their abilities and I know what they'd be able to do. So I'd be able to talk to an employer and make sure that the job match is really great. We can also suggest workplace accommodations to enhance employee performance. So if the employee sometimes, especially with younger folks with disabilities, they don't know what accommodations they need or what support they could use. And service providers are great for this because we have a bunch of things in our back pocket that we've used before, and we can kind of offer some solutions for any issues that come up. Service providers can go with employees on their first day, especially anybody who has anxiety or who needs those accommodations to make sure that they're in place, help to establish a daily work routine and schedule, accompany new employees. So let's say the employees worked at the organization for a long time and they're doing really well, but now they're getting retrained for another position. Well, a service provider can come in and help with that as well. And also provide supplemental training for specific job duties. We can help to increase the work speed of a new employee. Any of those kinds of issues that come up, reaching out to a service provider is really helpful. We can also model appropriate work-related behaviors and assist new employees with social integration into the workplace. Job coaches and job developers assist during the process of hiring, and they provide continuous support on a personalized basis. So it's really important to reach out to service providers if you have any questions or need any help. That's what they're there for, and it's a free service. A couple more things. They can help you analyze job duties or tasks to make your workplace more accessible. So if you want to hire more people with disabilities, but you're unsure about how accessible your workplace is, service providers can come in and do an assessment with you and help you with those kind of policy changes and physical changes as well. So definitely reach out to service providers for assistance. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some disability etiquette. We are going to go a little bit more detail into it next week when we talk about creating inclusive environments. But this etiquette is going to be specific for interviews. So now we have an accessible website and we have some applicants with disabilities who applied and we're having them come in for an interview. So there's a few important things to consider. So interviewing a person with a visual impairment, you want to make sure when greeting someone with visual impairment, you identify yourself and anyone else that's present. You offer assistance, but wait until your offer is acknowledged and then wait or ask for instructions. This is a really big one. It's going to come up again later on as well. But a lot of folks with disabilities, while it is really nice to offer them help, just make sure you're asking if they actually want or need your help or how you can best help them before just jumping in and making that assumption. A lot of folks want to be nice, and that's really great, but sometimes it's more harmful than helpful. So you just want to keep that in mind. If the person with the visual impairment needs to be escorted somewhere, you can invite them to take your arm at the elbow and guide them rather than push them, giving verbal directions along the way. For example, we are now going to walk through a doorway, or there's a step here, or the bathroom is on the left, whatever. Provide verbal directions at about the location of the applicant's chair, where you'd like them to be seated and where you're going to be seated. If you move around, let them know, or if you need to end the conversation, or if someone pops their head in your office and needs you for a second, just remember that they can't pick up on those visual cues. So you just have to kind of let them know what's going on. Let the person know if someone leaves or enters the room, and if a service animal is present, no matter how cute they are, we have to refrain from interacting with that animal as they are working. Interviewing a person with a hearing impairment, if a sign language interpreter is present, they will usually sit beside the interviewer and across from the person with the disability. So ASL interpreters is a question that I get asked a lot. It is the employer's responsibility to hire an ASL interpreter. They're usually not too expensive. There are some kicking around Halifax that are freelance, and they can be as little as $20 an hour. There are also a lot of agencies you can use, and those prices do increase. I've seen as much as $100 an hour, because normally they'll send, if it's an hour-long interview, they'll send two interpreters so they can switch out. But always ask, so when the person asks about an accommodation in their initial application and you reach out to them about that, ask them if they have someone they prefer. A lot of people with hearing impairments have regular ASL interpreters that they use all the time, and that's just the easiest thing, because they're comfortable with that person. Yeah, and if they don't have someone that they can use, again, reach out to those service providers. That's what we're here for, and we have all of those contacts and can definitely help you with that. And of course, now, because of COVID, we know that Zoom is a perfectly reasonable way to have an interview, and that's always an option for any person with a disability. They may find it easier to have a Zoom interview, and that's always an option as well, especially if the ASL interpreter maybe can't travel to your location or something like that. If the candidate with a hearing impairment can read lips, make sure you look at them directly and speak clearly at a normal pace. Don't exaggerate your lip movements and don't shout, doesn't make a difference. Speak expressively, because the person will also rely on facial expressions, gestures, and eye contact. ASL, for those of you who know, is just a very expressive language, and folks with hearing impairments are really looking for those kind of facial expressions to go along with what you're saying if they're reading your lips. And if the candidate does not read lips, you can use brief notes or make sure to have an ASL interpreter for them. Interviewing a person with a mobility issue, treat the wheelchair or walker or canes as part of the person's personal space. Be aware that some wheelchair users may prefer to transfer themselves into an office chair for the interview, so ask them if they would prefer that, and provide a chair preferably without wheels and that has like something on the side, usually, like armrests. But again, just ask the person what they would prefer. Enable people to use crutches, canes, or wheelchairs. Allow them to keep them within their reach in case they need to access them. And to facilitate conversation with a person in a wheelchair, for example, you want to sit in a chair that allows you to be at that person's eye level. And again, just ask them. Some people may prefer, I mean, usually we're sitting down for interviews, but if you are standing for some reason, some people may just prefer you stand a little bit further back so that they don't have to look up at you. Things like that are just really important to keep in mind. So accessible interviewing in general, we want to make sure we choose an interview location that's accessible to candidates with disabilities. Identify accessible parking options, for example. Provide clear directions about where to meet. So thinking about folks who have maybe cognitive disabilities, you want to make sure that you're providing really simple and clear instructions about where to meet. When arranging for interviews, inform all applicants that accommodations are available upon request. Just make sure you repeat that so that people are aware that they can ask at any time if they need something. And help your front office staff to learn how to interact appropriately with people with disabilities. So making sure that anyone that's coming into contact with the person who's being interviewed does have those kinds of disability etiquette and inclusive kind of things in mind. Some helpful tips. It's always better, and kind of, I think most industries are moving more towards this, to have an interview team rather than an individual person, which can help reduce individual bias, which, as much as we don't like to admit, we all do have personal bias, and it's just better to have more than one person judging someone. The interview team should include staff members who understand disability and diversity issues. And a diverse interview team will provide insight into responses that other team members may not fully grasp. So people with disabilities, especially folks who are neurodiverse, they may answer a question in a different or unique way. And sometimes it's really great just to debrief those kind of more unique or creative answers as a team to make sure that we fully understand and that the question was answered and expressed in a great way. A few more things to consider. What processes are in place to ensure the interview location is accessible? So, for example, consider that some candidates may need to pre-book accessible transit, like the Accessibus here, up to 7 days in advance. So, if you're looking to hire someone immediately, but you have a great candidate who has a disability, you need to wait. If you can interview everyone else in the first couple of days and you want to hire those people, it's not really fair. You want to wait until that person is available to come in for an interview, and you don't want to take it as a bad sign that they're not interested. Sometimes people just have accessibility issues that they need to sort out, and the Accessibus, there's just no way around it. It needs to be booked 7 days in advance. So considering that, do you know what you'll do if someone requires an ASL interpreter? So I did kind of talk about that a little bit. Feel free to reach out to service providers at any time if you need assistance with something like that, and ask the person if they'd prefer to book the interpreter themselves. How can you make your space more accessible? So thinking about, just walking around and thinking about, can a person with a mobility disability get into and move around the interview space? Move chairs and things out of the way to make them more accessible. It's just a good practice in general. And is the important information written down? So is there something that people can take away with them to review later? Some people with disabilities need time to process afterwards or have memory issues. A lot of people with traumatic brain injuries, they might have issues with their short-term memory. And so they may ask you to just make sure everything is written down, and you want to make sure those kinds of things are ready. Some people will have difficulty processing information auditorily, and they may listen in the interview and then may need to review the important information afterwards. So just things like that to consider that can make your process more accessible. So we're going to move on now to talking more about what to do when someone does disclose that they have a disability and how to accommodate them. So potential or hired employees are not required to disclose their disability to you legally. It is a very personal choice. So we want to leave it up to them to discuss their needs with you. So by law, employers are not allowed to ask, do you have a disability? However, employers can ask these questions. Do you have any health issues that would prevent you from doing this job? Are there any barriers that prevent you from meeting the physical requirements of this position? Are you able to perform the essential functions of this position? And can you demonstrate how you would perform the required functions? And do you require an accommodation to perform this job? So if someone hasn't disclosed so far for the interview process that they need an accommodation, after you offer them the job, you should ask again if they require an accommodation. And again, they don't have to disclose their disability to request an accommodation, but it also leaves the space open for them to disclose if they want to. Now, sometimes an employee may not disclose. So it's a very personal decision, and employers are not allowed to ask. So why might someone disclose, or why may they not? So some reasons why a person may disclose to you is that they require an accommodation for the interview or for the job. They may have a visible disability and they want to discuss their ability to do the job. So for a lot of folks with visible disabilities, they just want to make sure that it's really clear that even though they have this disability that you can see, it's not going to affect their ability to do the job. They may just want to be honest and upfront about their disability. Maybe it's a really huge part of their identity and they want to talk about that in the interview with you. And they may want to self-identify for employment equity policies. Some employers have, a certain quota that they want to fill to make their workplace more diverse, and they may just want to make it clear that they are part of a minority that you may be looking for. So reasons why an employee may not disclose. The number one thing is just fear of being discriminated against. I just hear it a lot from the folks that I am working with. The person may have an invisible disability and they don't need any accommodations. They may have strategies to help them do the job and they can manage their disability well. Not all folks with disabilities require an accommodation, and most folks who, especially people who have had disabilities since birth, they know how to manage their disability, they know what they need, and they just maybe don't need anything from you. Sometimes it's just personal and they don't want to disclose. And sometimes they don't know how to disclose, or they may have had a bad experience in the past with talking about their disability. And so they just would rather not. So just a quick review of some best hiring practices before we move on to accommodations. So the employer will focus on essential and critical tasks rather than secondary functions. The employer focuses on the employee's capabilities in order to match workers and job requirements. So if you have someone who can do 9 out of 10 things that are essential for the job and you think they're a really good match, but there's one thing that they can't do or they need an accommodation to do, can you make that accommodation for them, or can you just give that one task maybe to someone else or have someone support them with that one task when they require? The employer receives input from people with disabilities on their abilities to perform job duties. Ask, ask, ask. Just don't be afraid to ask questions about what they can do and what they need from you. The employer can supervise a diverse workforce. So if you're going to make a commitment to having a more inclusive workforce, you need to have the education and the background to be able to supervise that diverse workforce. And coming and having these conversations with me and listening to that information is a really great start. And things are always evolving and we have to be open to conversation and open to learning and adapting. The employer is open to service provider agencies and support resources. Don't be afraid to reach out to all the service providers. We have a great community in Halifax and in Nova Scotia of people who want to help you be more inclusive. And we have tons and tons and tons of clients, as all my other service providers on the call can attest to, tons of people looking for work who would be a really great match. And we know them really well and can match them really well with the perfect job. And the employer recognizes the benefit of working with community-based agencies in order to connect with skilled employees. So again, like reaching out to the service providers who have that database of people looking for work. So once we've hired someone, we have talked to them about any accommodations that they need, we want to make sure that our training and orientation is accessible as well. So again, reaching out to your local service provider for additional assistance if needed. Talk to your staff about the new employee's first day on the job. We don't want to make it a big thing that like, oh, this person has a disability and we need to be careful about this or we need to do about this. It's not like that. It's just letting people know that this person is coming. They have this accommodation in place. So for example, if the person has mobility issues, just again, reiterating to staff, like, let's make sure that entrances are clear and stuff like that, which really we should be doing anyway, for general safety. We want to learn how to greet, communicate, and interact with people in non-traditional ways. For example, I talked about interacting with people who are blind or visually impaired, people who use a wheelchair, or in some cases, people who are autistic or have other non-visible disabilities may just require a non-traditional approach. You want to provide the coworkers with awareness training if there's a need to highlight specialized disability support. For example, if the new employee has a guide dog, we want to just, reiterate to staff not to touch the dog or interact with the dog, or any other needs that the new hire may have talked to you about. Make sure that all the required paperwork is in an accessible format. So anything that they need to fill out, just making sure it's accessible for that person and their unique disability. Ensure that any previously discussed accommodations are in place and all equipment to be used by the new employee is in place and adequate. So making sure that everything's ready for them on the first day that they get there is really important. And consider identifying a support person or a mentor or go-to person for the new employee. That's just a great general best practice for hiring any new employee, but can be really helpful for a person with disabilities, especially if you have other people with disabilities that are in your organization. They can create a little community for themselves and feel like they have some allies in the organization, which is really good. So we're going to talk about accommodations now. So I'm going to start with the duty to accommodate and explain kind of what that means, and then go into how to accommodate specifically. So the duty to accommodate is a legal obligation, which has been confirmed and clarified by the courts, including the Supreme Court of Canada. So the purpose of the duty to accommodate is to ensure that persons who are otherwise fit to work are not unfairly excluded where working conditions can be adjusted without undue hardship. So it basically just means if someone can do the job and you can make an accommodation for them, you should make that accommodation. In fact, you have to. The duty to accommodate applies in relation to any aspect of employment, including pre-employment testing, work environment, training, and promotions. So again, making sure those accommodations are in place for training. Or let's say the person needs no accommodations at the workplace, but you're all going on a retreat together, a work retreat, and that person might require an accommodation for that specific situation. So we want to be thinking of those things. Really, employers want every employee to be the most productive they can be. And this is accomplished by providing the tools that they need to be effective and efficient, just as you would for any other employee. So employers must consult the person who needs the accommodation before implementing it. And the worker has an obligation to cooperate in an effort to arrive at a reasonable accommodation. So really, it's a conversation between the employer and the new hire who requires the accommodation about how to best serve that person. They are going to know what their needs are. The most successful accommodation outcomes happen when parties are able to work collaboratively and respectfully to find meaningful and effective solutions. So just remember that it's an ongoing conversation, and to make sure that everybody feels valued and heard during that conversation, and it'll be a very smooth process if that's the case. So duty to accommodate up to undue hardship. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means. It applies to the protected characteristics under the human rights legislation and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, to include gender, nationality, disability, race, ethnic origin, color, religion, creed, age, sexual orientation, marital or family status, and criminal convictions for which a pardon has been granted. So under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we have all of these areas where we know we cannot discriminate people. Employers, service providers, and unions must take the steps to eliminate any disadvantages to employees, prospective employees, or clients resulting from rules or physical barriers that have an adverse impact. So if you have anything that's affecting people based on that criteria, it needs to be accommodated. True equality means respect for people's different needs, and this means valuing and accommodating differences so that all employees can work to the best of their abilities. So that's really all we're trying to do with this duty to accommodate, is just create some equity and inclusion. So a few things to know about accommodating up to undue hardship. If a medical examination is a job requirement, some jobs do require this, the examination can only be conducted after the job offer has been made and accepted. That's true for all people, not just people with disabilities. We want to make sure that they can do the job and that we're not ruling them out based on any physical criteria. The need for accommodation cannot be used to evaluate the merits of an applicant or employee during the selection process. So basically, if you have two people who are exactly great candidates and one person requires an accommodation and the other person does not, it would be unethical to hire the person who does not require an accommodation just simply because you don't want to make that accommodation, right? So just wanting to hire the best person for the job based on their individual characteristics. The need for accommodation could arise during the employment selection process, at the start of employment, or at any point after the employee has already started. Now, this is really important because, again, people don't have to disclose. So maybe they think that they can do the job without disclosing, and then they do it and they decide they do need an accommodation. Or perhaps the nature of their disability has changed. There are a lot of disabilities that over time they get worse, or they're cyclical. And so they might get worse for a time and then they might get better. And so an employee may need an accommodation just during that time, but not always, right? So we want to be really open-minded and understanding that these things do change and these accommodations can come up at any time. And an employee's probationary period can only start after they've been accommodated. So what is undue hardship? How do we know when that's an issue? So there's no concrete definition of undue hardship. It's very hard to define. It's on a case-by-case basis, but it implies that the employer has an obligation to occur at least some hardship. So when we are accommodating people, it is going to take some time, some effort, and maybe some money. So we are going to incur some quote unquote hardship. But undue hardship describes the point beyond which employers are not expected to accommodate, as the request would cause significant harm to the organization. So for example, an accommodation would impose undue risk to the health or safety of any worker, or the accommodation costs so much it's excessively high and it jeopardizes the business's survival, or the accommodation threatens to change the essential nature of the business as it exists at this time. So for example, a small business may not be able to afford an elevator. That would cause undue hardship. But the installation of a front door ramp would probably be possible, right? So we want to think about what solutions we can offer to accommodate the person, without it costing the business. That's not the point of this, right? The point of this is just to make things more equitable and inclusive, not to run you out of business. Also keep in mind that there is a lot of funding available for accessible retrogrades to older buildings, for example. So before you just say, oh, that's undue hardship, I can't afford that, take the time to look into and research what actually is available, because again, we have that legislation to get Nova Scotia accessible by 2030. So if there's something that you can do and there's funding available, why not do it? So employers must identify and eliminate any rules that have a discriminatory impact that cannot be justified under the law. So if you have an arbitrary rule and you feel like it may be discriminatory, just get rid of it or revamp your policies. The goal is to prevent barriers to accessibility from occurring in the first place, rather than having to remove them retroactively. So think about when I talked about universal design, we want to be thinking about how to make things more accessible before they need to be accessible, right? Just so that when you find the right candidate, there's no accommodation that they need because you already have an accessible building and accessible policies, etc. When we design inclusively from the start, our products and services work for everyone. And accommodation also means changing rules or practices to allow people to do things differently. So, if you've done things the same way forever and it's never been a problem, and then you have an employee come and say, hey, listen, I could use this accommodation, maybe just change the rules or practices for everyone to make them more inclusive in the future. So we'll talk a little bit about the types of accommodations that are common and how to plan for them. So accommodation strategies that address disabilities are intended to support productivity and performance. The range of possible accommodations is very wide and should be considered on a case-by-case basis. And accommodations generally fall into 4 categories, and most of them do not necessarily incur any costs. So there's individual, the environment, tasks, and then tools. So these are the 4 areas that most accommodations fit under. We talked about the most common workplace accommodations. So modified work hours, days, or reduced hours. This is the number one accommodation, and it's so easy to accommodate someone. Again, we want to be thinking about, the hours, like, do those hours work for everyone? Could someone work from home some of the time? Could someone work a 4-day work week instead of a 5-day work week? Or a really common accommodation that I do for a lot of folks I work with is they might work Monday, Tuesday, have Wednesdays off, and then work Thursday, Friday, or even Saturday if it's maybe a business that's open on Saturdays, just to get that kind of break midweek. Some folks with chronic pain or different disabilities, really just it's hard for them to work 5 straight days in a row, and that break in the middle of the week can really increase their effectiveness. So modified or different duties, what accommodations can we put in place? Special chairs and back supports or standing desks. Those kinds of things usually do have some costs associated, but they're usually under $500, and there is a lot of funding again available for those kinds of things. Number 5, working from home. This has always been a really common accommodation, but now with COVID, we know that it is possible. And if it's something that we can accommodate, now we know how well we can work collaboratively. Special software, technical aids, things like that are really not very difficult to get. They're not very expensive. Accessible elevators, handrails, ramps, widened doorways, and hallways. Those are the most expensive. Adapted washrooms as well. But again, if we want to reach that accessibility by 2030 goal that the government has outlined, we want to make sure that we are thinking about how to retrofit older buildings, or if we're moving into a new space, for example, how accessible is that new space? And do we want to ask the landlord to make those accessibility changes before we move there? And again, there is a lot of funding, particularly through the government, but also through the Rick Hansen Foundation. So just remember, when accommodating employees, there's a variety of ways to accommodate employees with a disability. And we just want to remember to be flexible. No 2 situations or disabilities will be alike. You want to work with candidates and employees to determine what works, and this will benefit everybody. Research available funding for a more accessible workplace or ways to support individual needs. Reach out to service providers. We generally have the answers for these questions or know where to find them. And ask your current or new employees if they need an accommodation. People often know how to help themselves and what they need. And you may even have some employees currently working for you that require an accommodation or could use some support in some areas. So most of the time, when we accommodate someone, it's just a kind of a verbal agreement, or maybe we'll put it in their contract that they sign. But sometimes, especially if you're looking for funding from the government, there is a formal process that you have to go through. So step 1 is just to recognize the accommodation that is needed. So this is just through a conversation with the person requesting it, and then gather any relevant information. So make sure that the employee is really active in this step and that they can give you all the information that you need to make the accommodation. If you can't make the accommodation, you need to provide them with an explanation, because it needs to be justified in court if it's undue hardship. You want to write up the formal individual accommodation plan. It doesn't have to be super complicated, but it is good to have a written documentation of it. And then step four, arguably the most important, is monitor and review the accommodation plan. So you want to make sure after a few weeks or a month or whatever that it is actually working for that employee and that it is actually helping them. And again, if it's someone who has a disability that may get worse over time or may change over time, you want to come back and review and make sure that the accommodation that you made for them is still working for them. And if they need anything else, then the accommodation process will just happen over again, or you can just modify the existing accommodation. Some retention strategies, just generally, we want to treat employees with disabilities just as any other employee with regard to retention. Employers should enable all employees to do their best by providing access to tools, resources, information, equipment, and career development opportunities. All people want this, right? Not just people with disabilities or people without disabilities, just a good practice overall. We want to tailor any onboarding specific to new hires with disabilities so that it includes information on procedures for requesting accommodations. And that can be really helpful to help people navigate that at the beginning. Socialization practices can help new hires become embedded in the company and make them more likely to stay. You want to make sure that they're integrated and they feel part of the workplace culture. Formal and informal activities to help people get to know one another at the beginning, and assignment of more experienced employees as role models for new hires. This is proven to be the best way to retain, is to have a mentor in your workplace. How inclusive is your organization right now? So think about, does your organization, is it open to having job candidates disclose a mental illness during an application or interview process, right? So think back to those ads. Are you putting that information in your ad that you are an equal opportunity employer? My organization asks prospective employees what they need to succeed. Are you asking people this? Are you presenting yourself as a place that supports and values employees with mental illness and disabilities? Are you seeking feedback about employers' challenges or frustrations on an ongoing basis? Are you conducting regular check-ins to help employees maximize their capabilities and potential on the job? Are you following up? Just having one conversation when you hire someone and then checking in with them years later, that's not going to work, right? You want to make sure your employees are happy and well adjusted all the time so they'll stick around. Are you seeking regular input about employees' professional development goals and how they can achieve them? You want people to grow and learn with your organization. Are you encouraging people to suggest ideas for the workplace that they may find value or benefit from? And are you actively looking for employees' input on potential solutions to any work-related challenges or issues that come up? So just having these ongoing conversations with our employees is really helpful.